The bruise showed up like an accusation, a purple map blooming across my daughter's soft skin, curling under the delicate curve of her ribcage where a dress strap had once hidden the truth. I saw it in a photograph, sent by my sister at 3 in the morning, a trembling message that read, "Call me now." That picture arrived like a pistol shot in a quiet house. It woke every muscle I had, and I felt something cold and terrible settle into my chest. The world that had protected my girl had failed her. I am 57, and I have learned, the hard way, that age does not soften certain instincts. It sharpens them. The uniform I keep folded in the back of my closet, the one I had promised myself I'd never wear again, suddenly felt like armor not for show but for duty. Not because I wanted to parade some authority, but because uniforms carry weight. They make people listen. They make space for truth to be heard. When I walked into my daughter's apartment that night, she flinched at my voice, the way a bird flinches at a shadow. She had tried to hide the bruise at first with baggy sweaters and the practiced smile of someone pretending everything was okay. But the photo ruined the pretense. Up close, it was worse, the color shifting from angry plum to mottled gold, the soft skin bruised and tender. She tried to laugh it off. I could hear the lie in it. "How long?" I asked, because the first thing a father does is measure the damage. She shrugged, eyes down. "It was an accident, Dad. He didn't mean it." Her voice was small, and the room seemed to grow smaller around it. "He didn't mean it." I have heard that before in different shapes and different accents. It is the phrase abusers use to rewrite the moment something monstrous becomes undeniable. It was an accident. He didn't mean it. Meaningless words for a wound that whispers fear into the night. My son-in-law tried to steer the conversation the way a man steers a car into a ditch, with bluster and charm and a hurried promise that he'd make it right. But when men try to charm away a photograph, the only thing you can trust is what the picture shows. The bruise didn't need his alibis. It needed accountability. Under the kitchen light I picked up the uniform from the chair where it lay folded like an unspoken threat. It was not the badge itself that mattered, it was the promise that I had once kept to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That promise felt younger and larger than the years on my face. I shook the fabric, let it unfold. The smell of starch took me back, to nights on patrol, to standing in doorways while chaos pretended to be ordinary life. I remembered how, once, my presence had made men reconsider their next move. I told my daughter 2 things that night: first, that I believed her; second, that whatever she decided, she wouldn't have to face it alone. She pressed her head to my chest and cried, a sound that loosened something inside me like a bolt. For a long time after, the house was full of whispers, plans half-formed, names listed and crossed out, calls placed and hung up. We were not naive. We both understood the consequences of escalation. But we also understood the consequence of silence. When I left, putting the uniform on felt less like preparing for war and more like answering an oath. I would walk into the world wearing the memory of a career and the fury of a father. I would not break laws to protect my child, nor would I wear the uniform as a threat to intimidate. I would use my presence, my voice, my knowledge of how people think when confronted by authority. I would gather facts, witnesses, receipts, a quiet dossier that would not rely on fury but on proof. There was another feeling, quieter and darker, that snaked along the edges of my resolve, the taste of revenge. It did not come as a roaring thing of a single night. It arrived patient and deliberate, like frost creeping over a pond, waiting for the right moment to slide and break the ice. I did not want to become the man who reveled in revenge, but I understood this: when someone harms your child, the line between protector and avenger blurs. Duty becomes personal. That night I slept in the living room, the uniform folded at the foot of the couch. I made a list on a scrap of paper: doctors to call, the number of the neighbor who had cameras, the email address of the blogger who loved scandal, the plate number my daughter vaguely remembered. Each item placed on the page steadied me. Each crossed-off task would be another piece of armor. I would start with the facts and with the law. I would follow the paper trail and the body language, and if those failed, there were other currencies: exposure, reputation, the small cruelties that ripple until men who hurt learn that consequences are not only legal but social. But those thoughts belong to the future. For now, the hook tightened, the bruise on my daughter's skin had become proof, the uniform in my hands an instrument, and the promise to myself as clear as the dark: I will not let this stand. The next morning, I was at her apartment before the sun had fully climbed the sky. I didn't bother knocking softly. When your daughter's been hurt, you don't approach like a guest, you arrive like a storm. He opened the door, my son-in-law, still in a wrinkled t-shirt, eyes red from a night he probably thought he'd sleep off. The moment he saw me in uniform, his posture shifted, he straightened, cleared his throat, forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sir," he said, like we were strangers. That told me everything. Men who say sir to their father-in-law are hiding something. I stepped inside, past him, without waiting for permission. My daughter was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes swollen from tears she'd spent the night denying. She looked up at me, then away, as if ashamed. My stomach twisted, but I kept my face calm. If I let my rage show, he'd use it as a shield. I turned back to him. "We need to talk." He stammered, waving a hand, trying to brush it off. "It was nothing. Just an accident." She tripped, and I. "Stop." My voice was sharp, clipped. An accident doesn't leave a mark like that. And an accident doesn't make a woman afraid to tell the truth in her own home. For the first time, the smirk dropped. His eyes darted between me and the door, calculating. I knew the look, I'd seen it too many times before on men cornered by their own actions. I lowered myself into a chair at the table, leaned forward, and folded my hands. "You've got one chance," I told him. "One chance to tell me what happened. After that, I don't want your excuses. I want your honesty." He opened his mouth, closed it, then laughed nervously. "You're blowing this out of proportion. She's fine. Aren't you?" He looked to my daughter, desperate for her to cover for him. She shifted under the blanket, her lips pressed tight, her silence louder than any denial. That was my answer. I stood, slow and deliberate. "Listen carefully," I said, my voice as steady as the badge I once wore. "If I ever see another bruise on her, if I hear another whisper of your temper, you won't be explaining yourself to me. You'll be explaining yourself to the people who put men in cages." He swallowed, his throat bobbing. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the realization sinking in that this wasn't a bluff. I didn't stay to argue. I kissed my daughter's head, whispered, "I've got you," and left. As the door closed behind me, I knew this wasn't finished. He had seen my warning. Now I needed to decide whether to wait for him to slip, or make sure he never had the chance. Warnings alone don't change a man like him. I'd seen that pattern too many times, first the denial, then the promises, then the relapse. It always ended the same: the bruises got darker, the lies got bolder, and the fear settled deeper. If I wanted to protect my daughter, I couldn't just threaten him. I needed proof. So I started watching. Not like a father, like an investigator. The next evening, I drove back to their apartment and parked down the block. From the driver's seat, I could see their front windows glowing yellow against the night. Their neighbor across the hall, an older woman with sharp eyes, came out to take her trash. I introduced myself, and it didn't take much for her to open up. "I hear them fight," she said, her voice hushed. "Mostly late at night. She cries. He yells. Once, I heard a crash, like something breaking. I almost called the police." I thanked her, gave her my number, and told her not to hesitate if she heard anything again. Her hand trembled when she pressed mine, but in her eyes I saw relief. People who live near violence always know it, they're just waiting for someone strong enough to name it. Back at my daughter's apartment, I convinced her to let me take pictures of the bruise. She resisted at first, ashamed, insisting she didn't want to make it worse. But I told her the truth, this isn't about shame. It's about protection. If he ever tries to deny it, we'll have the evidence. The flash of the camera lit the room like lightning, catching the purple-yellow mark in full detail. Each photo felt like a blade, cutting through his lies, preparing a weapon I could use. The next day, I visited an old friend from the force, now working as a private security consultant. Over coffee, I laid out the situation, careful with my words. He listened quietly, then leaned back. If he's smart, he'll back off after your warning. If he's not, he shook his head. Then you're going to need more than a uniform to stop him. I left with my jaw tight and my mind racing. The bruise had started the clock. Now I was building a case, piece by piece, because men like him only regret when the weight of the world comes crashing down on their shoulders. And I was ready to drop it. It didn't take long. Men like him can't hold their masks for long, not when anger is their first language. 2 weeks after my warning, my phone buzzed just past midnight. It was the neighbor from across the hall. Her voice shook through the line. He's yelling again. She's crying. I think he hit something, or someone. I was out the door before she finished. By the time I reached the apartment, the shouting was still echoing through the thin walls. I didn't bother knocking. I used the spare key my daughter had slipped me and stepped inside. The scene was as I feared, the coffee table overturned, glass shattered on the carpet, and my daughter pressed into a corner with her arms raised like a shield. My son-in-law stood over her, his face twisted in rage, a fist clenched as if frozen mid-strike when he realized I was there. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting had been. He tried to recover, stammering, "It's not what it looks like." "Save it," I cut him off, my voice hard as stone. I raised my phone, the camera already recording. "I told you once. I warned you. And now you've given me everything I need." He froze, eyes darting to the glowing screen in my hand. His bravado slipped, replaced by something smaller, panic. "Turn that off," he demanded, but his voice lacked power now. I didn't move. I kept the lens on him, capturing every twitch, every ounce of guilt painted across his face. My daughter sobbed behind me, her breath broken and shallow, but I kept my stance firm. "You're done," I said. "This isn't an accident, it isn't a mistake, it's a pattern. And patterns like this end one of two ways, in a cell, or in ruin. You choose." He muttered something under his breath, some mix of excuses and curses, but I'd stopped listening. I helped my daughter gather her things, her purse, a jacket, the essentials. We left him standing there in the wreckage of his own making. That night, I drove her back to my house. She cried herself to sleep in her old room, the walls still covered in posters from her teenage years. I sat outside her door in the dark, uniform folded beside me, phone heavy in my hand. The video burned in my pocket like a live coal. He had slipped. And I had caught him. Now it was time to decide how far I was willing to go. By morning, the decision was clear. A bruise could be dismissed as an accident. A photo could be explained away. But video? Video doesn't lie. Video carries weight in a courtroom, in front of a jury, in the eyes of the law. I called another old colleague, now a detective still working the domestic violence unit. We met in the diner where we used to grab midnight coffee during patrols. I slid my phone across the table, the screen paused on the moment my son-in-law froze mid-rage. My friend watched in silence, his jaw tightening, then let out a long breath. "Damn," he muttered. "That's more than enough to start a case. She'll need to file a statement, but with this? He's in serious trouble." I nodded. "She's scared. But she'll do it. She has to." That afternoon, I sat with my daughter in my kitchen, the paperwork spread out like a map of her future. Her hands trembled as she signed, but there was steel in her eyes. For the first time since I'd seen that bruise, she looked like herself again, not broken, not ashamed, but ready to fight. When we turned the report in, my badge no longer carried authority, but my presence did. The officers at the desk recognized me, straightened their posture, and treated her with the seriousness she deserved. No dismissive smiles, no condescending tones, just respect. That mattered. My son-in-law was served with a restraining order within 48 hours. The papers hit him like a thunderclap. Neighbors watched as he was escorted out of the apartment, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his face pale with fury. Word spread fast, co-workers, friends, even his own family whispered about the man who had been caught on camera, the man who hit instead of loved. For me, it wasn't about gossip. It was about safety. For the first time in months, I knew my daughter could breathe without flinching at every slammed door. She stayed with me while the case moved forward, and every night I checked the locks twice before I sat in my chair, uniform jacket hanging by the door like a silent sentinel. But revenge, real revenge, wasn't finished yet. The law would punish him, yes. But the weight of his choices? That was something I could ensure he carried long after the judge's gavel fell. And I was ready to make sure he felt it. The restraining order kept him out of her life, but I wanted more than distance. I wanted consequences. So I turned my focus to the one thing abusers fear almost as much as jail, losing the mask they wear in public. My son-in-law prided himself on being a family man. At his office, he played the role of the charming husband, the reliable co-worker, the guy everyone could trust. That persona was his shield, the thing he thought made him untouchable. But now, I had the power to rip it away. Through my old contacts, I learned his company had a strict code of conduct, especially about domestic violence. I scheduled a quiet meeting with HR. I didn't go in as a father-in-law out for blood, I went in as a man with evidence. I slid the video across the table, the same way I had in the diner. The room went silent except for the hum of the projector. The head of HR, a stern woman who had seen plenty of complaints in her career, leaned back in her chair. "This," she said carefully, "is not something we can ignore." Within days, he was called in for a meeting he didn't see coming. I wasn't there, but I heard later how it went, the confusion on his face when he realized what evidence they had, the way his voice cracked as he tried to spin excuses. But excuses don't work when the truth is recorded. By the end of that week, he was suspended pending investigation. His paycheck stopped cold. The man who once strutted around in expensive jackets and bragged about promotions was suddenly scrambling. Bills piled up. The car payments he had flaunted became a noose. His friends at work avoided him, their polite smiles replaced with whispers. And my daughter? She began to heal. She enrolled in counseling, started sketching again, filling page after page with drawings she hadn't touched since college. She smiled more. The shadows under her eyes faded. Every small step she took back toward herself fueled my resolve to see this through. For the first time, the power balance shifted. He wasn't the man with control anymore. He was the man unraveling, brick by brick, as the world saw him for what he truly was. And I wasn't finished. By the time the case reached the courthouse, the mask was gone. He shuffled in wearing an ill-fitting suit, eyes darting toward the gallery as though searching for an ally. He found none. My daughter sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trembling but unbroken. She wore no makeup to hide the faint yellow traces of old bruises, because this time, she refused to hide. The prosecutor laid out the evidence cleanly, the photos, the medical report, the neighbor's testimony, and finally, the video I had captured that night. The room was silent as the footage played, his face twisting with rage, his body looming over her. When the recording ended, the silence lingered, thick and damning. His attorney tried to spin it, claimed it was a misunderstanding, that the bruise was from an accidental fall, that the video was taken out of context. But every word sounded thinner than the last, like paper tearing in a storm. The judge wasn't buying it, and neither was anyone else in that room. When my daughter testified, her voice shook at first, but then steadied. She described the nights of shouting, the slammed doors, the apologies that always came too late. She didn't look at him once. She looked at the judge, at the jury, at herself. For the first time, she was telling her story without fear. I watched him squirm, the same man who once thought he owned the ground she walked on. Now he looked small, a child caught in his own lies. When the gavel finally came down, the verdict was clear, guilty of assault. The sentence wasn't long, but it was enough. Probation, mandatory counseling, community service. More importantly, the restraining order was extended, ironclad and unshakable. He wouldn't be free to raise a hand against her again. Not without the law crashing down on him. As we left the courthouse, my daughter clutched my arm. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "For believing me. For fighting for me." I squeezed her hand gently. "Always," I said. But as we walked down the steps, I knew one thing: the court had punished him, yes. But punishment isn't the same as regret. Regret was something I was going to make sure he carried for the rest of his life. Court handed him the sentence, but life handed him the rest. And in my experience, the scars left by public shame cut deeper than any fine or mandatory class ever could. The story spread, as stories in small towns always do. Neighbors whispered in grocery aisles. Parents avoided inviting him to their children's parties. His name, once spoken casually at his workplace, became a quiet warning. When his suspension turned permanent, he tried to find work elsewhere, but every background check pulled up the same stain: domestic violence conviction. No company wanted to touch him. I didn't need to lift a finger for this part. His reputation carried the weight of his own choices. But I'll admit, I gave it a push. The video, carefully clipped to remove my daughter's face, made its way into the hands of people who didn't tolerate men like him. Advocacy groups. Community leaders. Even a local journalist who had been sniffing around for a story on accountability. They didn't publish his name directly, but the description was close enough. People connected the dots. Overnight, he went from a man of status to a man people crossed the street to avoid. Meanwhile, my daughter began to glow again. She took a new job at a design firm, moved into a small but sunlit apartment closer to me, and even adopted a dog. Each day she seemed lighter, freer, her laughter no longer forced but spilling out naturally. That was my real revenge, not the ruin of a man, but the rebirth of my child. As for him, I heard he was crashing on couches, begging favors, drinking more than working. Friends drifted away. His own family stopped defending him. And though I never sought him out, I sometimes caught wind of him, thin, unshaven, eyes darting like a man always expecting someone to remind him of what he had done. That was the beauty of it. The law gave him boundaries. But life? Life gave him a mirror. And every time he looked into it, he saw the uniform I wore, the bruise he left, and the justice that followed. Some stains don't wash out. His never would. It was nearly a year later when I saw him again. I'd thought he'd keep his distance forever, but men like him rarely stay quiet. One rainy evening, there was a knock on my door, hesitant, uneven. When I opened it, he stood there, soaked through, thinner than I remembered, eyes hollow with sleepless nights. "I need to talk," he said, voice rough. I didn't invite him in. I stepped outside instead, letting the rain hit my shoulders. "You've got 5 minutes," I said flatly. He shifted from foot to foot, wringing his hands. I'm sorry. For everything. I ruined my marriage, my job, my life. I lost everything because of what I did." His eyes lifted to mine, desperate. "But I've changed. I'm in counseling. I'm trying." I studied him in silence. Rainwater ran down his face, mixing with whatever tears he was holding back. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe he was just playing another angle. Either way, it didn't matter. "You're not here for forgiveness," I said. "You're here because you're drowning and you want me to throw you a rope." He flinched like the words had struck him. "Can't you? Don't you think I've suffered enough?" My jaw tightened. I thought of my daughter's bruise, her tears, the nights she woke up shaking. "You've suffered consequences," I said. "That's not the same thing as suffering enough. And whether you change or not, that's between you and whatever God you pray to. But you'll never come near her again. Not as a husband. Not as a friend. Not even as a shadow." His lips trembled, but he said nothing more. After a moment, he nodded faintly, turned, and walked back into the rain. I stood on the porch long after he was gone, the storm soaking me through, my heart steady. He wanted relief. He wanted a clean slate. But I wasn't the man to give it. Some debts aren't repaid. Some bridges, once burned, are better left in ashes. And if there was regret in him, then maybe that was the only justice left to deliver. Months passed after that rain-soaked night, and I never saw him again. Word drifted through neighbors and old friends, he'd moved 2 towns over, picking up odd jobs, living in a rented room above a garage. A man once so loud, so certain of his place in the world, now shrunk into a shadow people barely recognized. That was his choice. That was his regret. My daughter, meanwhile, thrived. The scar on her skin had long faded, but the scar on her heart took longer. She poured herself into her work, into her art, into the dog that followed her everywhere. I watched her stand taller each month, reclaiming pieces of herself he tried to steal. And when she laughed, really laughed, it was like sunlight breaking through a storm I thought might never end. One evening, as she sat across from me at the dinner table, she reached for my hand. "Dad," she said softly, "thank you. Not just for protecting me, but for showing me I didn't have to stay broken." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing against years of restraint. I had worn the uniform again, but it wasn't the badge or the authority that saved her. It was the promise behind it, the promise I had made the day she was born, that no matter what came, I would stand between her and the darkness. My son-in-law thought the bruise would fade into silence. He thought fear would keep her bound to him. But fear can be broken, and lies can be exposed. What he left on her body became the very thing that condemned him. Now, when I hang the uniform back in my closet, I don't see it as a relic of who I was. I see it as a reminder of who I still am, a father who stood up when it mattered most, a man who turned a bruise into a battle line, and won. And as for him, he will carry that regret like a second skin for the rest of his days. Because some wounds don't heal, not when they're carved into memory, not when they're stitched to your name. That was my justice. That was my revenge.